Thank you very much, Phil, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. And the truth is, I would only miss, a perfect storm conference because of the birth of a grandchild. And my children were courteous enough on this occasion to push it off one more month. So the next one is due next month. And had you delayed this anymore, I wouldn't have been able to make it. But I'm very pleased to be here, obviously. And I think that, and it's funny because I noted the same thing as our prior speaker. As soon as I saw the schedule of the topics to be discussed today, I noted that it's a very natural progression. We have a problem on the Israeli side, you've got a problem on the US side, you fix it, you balance all the risks, and now you realize that I don't want to deal with this anymore, right? And how do I get out of this net in the sense that on a going forward basis, once you've come into full compliance, you have any number of continuing tax reporting obligations, compliance issues, difficulties, frankly, in conducting business, because if you happen to inadvertently be a US person and you are trying to open up a bank account or get a loan or any of these other things, it becomes a very complicated ordeal. So for a variety of reasons, people have been considering more and more giving up their US citizenship. As part of that, and what I find is very interesting, you read in the papers, there is a constant reports in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal that the percentage of people who have actually given up their citizenship is multiplied by hundreds of percentages every year. But when you look at actual numbers, and I started doing this 10, 15 years ago, the numbers were 200-300 a year. So yes, it's gone up many thousands of a percent. So now it's last year, at the last count, was 2,999. So an increase, yes, significant increase, but in terms of actual numbers, this is a very small percentage of the 200 million taxpayers in the United States. So it's one of those things that are often discussed, but rarely seen. Having said that, there's a steady stream of people from my office, going to the Tel Aviv embassy here to give up their citizenship. So it's actually a very active market, at least from an Israeli perspective. Now, there are a lot of issues that need to be considered when one gives up or considers giving up their citizenship. Now, is it enter? There we go. And over the course of time, I have come across a number of questions that people will ask right out of the box without having considered any of the technical issues. But they say, I've heard lots of things, bad things can happen to you if you give up your citizenship. And first of all, some people come to the table and say, well, if I give up my citizenship, they feel like they've done something wrong, they've done something illegal. Is that really the case? Is that a fact, or is that simply fiction? The fact is, it's fiction. A U.S. citizen has, and I know this is a little circular, a constitutional right to give up their citizenship. Now, I don't know what happens to that constitutional right once you no longer have the protections of the Constitution. I'm not sure how all that works. But it's a little circular, but the bottom line is, as a citizen, you have an absolute right to give up your citizenship. So there's no concern about any illegality in that regard. Another question that has comes up often as sort of preliminary to the technical discussions of giving up citizenship is, if I give up my citizenship, it's going to spur some query from some governmental office, the IRS, the SEC, FINRA, or any of the other regulatory offices. I have never seen it happen. I've never heard about it happening. I've never read about it happening. I think that if a person is going to be audited, they're going to be audited, and if they're not, then they're not. Giving up the citizenship is not going to result in any particular further inquiry just by virtue of the fact that you've given up the citizenship. All right, so it's simply false, to the best of my knowledge. I will not be able to travel to the U.S. if I give up my citizenship. Now, this is of particular impact for people who live in Israel for a variety of reasons. It's not just traveling to the U.S., but as a general matter, they want to be able to travel freely and don't necessarily want to rely on having only an Israeli passport. So the basic rule is, again, not true. If you give up your citizenship, you can still obtain a worker's visa, E1, E2, L1, all the various visas. You can still travel to and from the United States. You can still, by the way, apply for a green card. You can still obtain citizenship again if you otherwise qualify. And we have funny enough, we have a number of people who've turned around and done that. They've actually given up their citizenships and 6-7 years later have decided Nah, they want to live in LA, and now we're in the process of applying for a green card, we obtain the green cards and so on, if you otherwise qualify. So there's no concern with respect to that. You do have to realize, though, if you are only a U.S. and, say, Israeli passport holder, and you give up your citizenship, you do need to apply for a visa, and it does sometimes happen that visas are not issued. I can tell you it's never happened in my experience. So I've never seen anyone not obtain a visa. Actually, Phil actually told me stole about his son-in-law, but he'll tell you that. I'll tell you that is another thing. But in my professional experience, I've not seen anyone not obtain a visa. And you can, in fact, apply for a visa the day after you've given up your citizenship. And they're issued in the normal course. One of the things that people will do, and I'm reminded about it by someone in the audience here who I assisted slightly in this regard, you can actually obtain passports from other countries that are part of the visa waiver program between the United States and the country. Basically, any EU country, Canada, and a variety of other countries around the world do not require you to obtain a visa in order to travel to and from the United States as a tourist matter, if you're not going to work and so on. So you can obtain passports through right of descent. I'm reminded, for example, that Hungary has such a program. If you're parent or grandparent, we've done the same thing for Australia. We've done the same thing in I think where else would be? I think France and a variety of other countries, and it's a matter of paperwork. And in some cases, you have to learn the local language. I believe in one case, I had a family that had to learn Hungarian for purposes of obtaining the passport. But they did it, and they obtained their passports. So that's a consideration, of course, but there's no per se bar with respect to traveling to and from the United States because you've given up your passport. I'll be placed on some sort of blacklist and questioned at the border. Well, you may be, if you're a drug dealer or an arms dealer or something, you may be placed on a blacklist, but you won't be placed on a blacklist because of your giving up your citizenship. I can say, though, in recent experience, I have had a few clients, too, that have been questioned at the border. And the border got one coming in from Canada and the other one coming in from Latin America. And I don't know why they were questioned as such, but what I tell them all is that, and we'll discuss this a little further as we get into the conversation, that you'll be issued, when you give up your citizenship, a CLN, Certificate of Loss of Nationality. And as long as you carry that with you when you enter the country, all questions will go away. Because sometimes the border guard doesn't read his notes properly or something along those lines. He says, and they will see that you had a U.S. passport. And as long as you can clearly explain, yes, I had a U.S. passport, here's my CLN, my Certificate of Loss of Nationality, and if your papers are otherwise in order, you're good to go. So it has happened once or twice, but there's, again, no particular note about that. Okay, so now we get into some of the, I think, important details and technical issues that one needs to consider in giving up their citizenship. And there are two regimes that apply here, and there's an immigration regime and a tax regime. The tax regime looks to the immigration regime and bases some of the tax conclusions and consequences on the immigration rules, but not in a consistent way. Well, let's start with the immigration side. So first of all, you start with who is a U.S. citizen. And here we have the easy cases, the person born in the United States. Those are the easy cases. And then you also have people who were naturalized, and those, of course, easy enough if you're naturalized. Then you have people who were born of U.S. citizen parents living abroad. And there it gets, and I won't go into all the details on this, but there it gets really complicated because there are the rules, the immigration rules in this regard changed, 10 times between 1930 and the present. And depending what block of years you're talking about, these 5 years or those 10 years, and what block of years that you were born in, you may have been a citizen by virtue of being born of a U.S. parent abroad, full stop, or you may have had a right to claim citizenship, in which case you're not a citizen unless you went and filed the papers and claimed the U.S. citizenship. And that distinction is going to be very important when we get to the tax side. But those are your basic classes of U.S. citizens. Now, again, from an immigration perspective, what's the process for releasing U.S. citizenship? It's actually pretty straightforward. There's a bunch of papers you have to fill out. And it used to be that depending on the consular office that you're dealing with, they had different forms. Over the past, I'll say, 3 or 4 years, there has been an effort to consolidate and make more uniform the process and procedures that the different offices use around the world. If you sort of work the network, you will learn about some very important distinctions among the various offices, and you can still use that to your advantage. But for the most part, there's a fairly uniform set of papers, not very complicated, that talk about how is it that you're a U.S. citizen? Were you born? Were you naturalized? What were your dates of residency in the United States? Have you ever otherwise committed an expatriating act? And here is where people in Israel can sometimes get themselves in a lot of trouble. There are certain acts where you are, as a matter of law, deemed to have given up your citizenship. One of them, for example, is if you become a very senior officer in a foreign army. And that makes a certain amount of sense. You can't be expected to be a senior officer in a foreign army that could come into conflict with the United States and still be a citizen of the United States. And so I have a number of Israeli generals who are U.S. born or otherwise, U.S. citizens, and they run into this problem that they may have per se given up their citizenship, although no one seems to know this rule, and they keep flying back and forth on their U.S. passports. So it's an interesting set of circumstances. But as I say, the variety of papers that you fill in, and now, for the most part, and this is only the past year and a half or so, the embassies require you to communicate with them by email. And I think the reason that they require that is that they don't want you to develop any particular relationship with the people that you're dealing with. That's the best that I can figure out, because in prior years, I actually had some very good relationships with people in Geneva, with people in London, and we managed to work that to our advantage in many, many cases. That's much more difficult to do now because you really don't know who the person is on the other side. You submit the papers to the embassy via email, and you wait. Depending on depending on the embassy that you're working with, it can take anywhere between 3 weeks or a year to get an interview. Now, as part of this process, the government requires that you be interviewed. The purpose of the interview is to make sure that you're giving up your citizenship by virtue of your own free will, that no one is coercing you to give up your citizenship. That's the only interest the government has in all of this. They want to make sure that you're doing this willfully as opposed to non-willfully. All right? But the result of that is that you cannot have anyone come with you to the interview. You cannot have your lawyer with you. You can't have your spouse with you, or your significant other, or otherwise. Simply not permitted. The only time I managed to finagle my way into the door was, again, based on a relationship with an 18-year-old girl who was giving up her citizenship. And this was in London, and this was with Bernadette, who I remember very well, who's since retired, who is the head of these activities out of the U.S. Embassy in London. And because of who I was, and I'd been dealing with Bernadette for years, and this was an 18-year-old woman, and so on and so forth, and they let me enter the room, but I wasn't allowed to open my mouth. Fine. But at least I got to sort of see firsthand what goes on there in the interview. In addition, what we do is we, in a sense, have an exit interview for all of our clients as well. So anyone who comes out of the embassy, we get on the phone with them the next day and say, all right, well, what did they ask you? What are they looking for? And again, what they're looking for is to make sure that no one is coercing you and that you understand the consequences of what you're doing. With respect to understanding the consequences of what you're doing, there's actually something that people are very concerned about, and rightfully so. Because occasionally you'll read about this in the papers, that if someone gives up their citizenship for purposes of avoiding U.S. tax, then they can be barred from entering the country. That is true. That is the law sort of as stated. However, there are a couple of practicalities behind that that have resulted in at least word on the street, and again, everything you read and hear, in that rule actually having never been enforced. The reason that rule has never been enforced, as best as anyone can tell, is there's no implementation regulations. There's no government arm that's actually charged with tracking people who give up their citizenship and coordinating that with Border Patrol and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, there's just been no one who's been barred from coming into the country as a result of giving up their citizenship driven by U.S. tax concerns. Having said that, my advice to my clients has generally been, there might be 5 reasons, right? And obviously you have to discuss this with your clients, but there might be 5 reasons why you're giving up your citizenship. U.S. tax is one of them. But it could also be that you don't travel much to the U.S. anymore, and it could also be that you're afraid to lose your passport. It could also be that your entire center life and vital interests and so on are all in Israel. There might be dozens of other reasons. To the extent that you are asked why you're giving up your citizenship, give one of those other reasons. don't give this one, because you don't want to be the guy where they note in the file that this fellow there's something wrong with. And there's a very funny story. Just the other day, I had a client who, we talk about doing things without advice, who some years ago went through this expatriation process himself. And I asked him, well, what did you do? What did you file? So he showed me. And one of the things he did was he submitted a letter to the consular agent. And the letter talked about, U.S. imperialism and all just like, this is not the place. This is not the place to make a statement. The other story I love to tell in terms of the interview is this one. A client of mine who gave up his citizenship about 2 years ago, and we talk about sort of uniformity of process. One of the things that the various embassies have fairly recently instituted is that you must give up your citizenship in an embassy where you are in the country in which you are a resident. So Israel, if you happen to live here, you give up your citizenship in Israel. This fellow is a very high-profile guy, happens to live in Latin America. We didn't want him going there. So again, we sort of worked the network, and what we discovered was that he has some relatives in Poland. And because he has relatives in Poland, we were able to contact the embassy there, back when you could still make a phone call, and speak to them and say, listen, he's an important businessman traveling through Poland. It's very hard for him to schedule these things. Could we do it while he's in Poland? They said, sure, but what came out at the end was they had never done an expatriation out of Poland. So we had to teach him. We had to basically teach them, this is what you do. Here, they didn't have the form. We sent them the forms. We did this whole story. We explained this is how you do it. But it seems that in Eastern Europe, there's an affinity towards U.S. citizenship, and people struggle to obtain citizenship. The idea of giving up your citizenship is an anathema. So at the end of the day, my client shows up over there, and there's a bit of you have to basically swear or state under penalties of perjury that you know what you're doing, you understand what and you hereby give up your citizenship, and you sign a piece of paper. So when it came to that point in the discussion, my client tells me, they took the American flag, they took my client, they took him out to the waiting room, and they made a general announcement and said, this gentleman is giving up his citizenship, and he's doing it of his own free will, and state that you're doing it, and swear on your heart and your mother's grave, or whatever else they had him do. And he was terribly embarrassed. So he walked out, he called me up just in a whole huff. You didn't tell me this was going to happen. And I said, the truth is I didn't know it was going to happen, and I had never heard of it happening in my experience. But I have to tell you, for the $1 billion of tax you saved, I would go do the same thing. So I have no concerns at all about that. And I think many of us would too. So it was a win in the sense they didn't ask him any of the questions that we would have been concerned about. The questions that they ask are, why are you giving up your citizenship? You give a truthful but general answer, right? Any answer, any question that can be answered with a yes or a no, you answer with a yes or a no. They will never ask you, are you U.S. tax compliant? Because it's none of their business what your U.S. tax compliance is. What they will ask you, or what they will say is, do you know that if you give up your citizenship and you have U.S. tax obligations, giving up your citizenship does not free you from those obligations? And the answer to that is, yes, I know. That's all. Don't say any more. So it's very much like we have some trial lawyers here. It's very much like prepping a person for a deposition or to give testimony in court. Never answer with 2 words if 1 word will do. And usually yes or no will do. If you follow that line of thought, we find that the exit interviews are really very, very simple. So anyway, there is an interview process, and that is, as I say, the purpose of the interview. We touched upon this a little bit in terms of timing considerations. Said to get that interview, once you've sent that email with all the paperwork, it will take anywhere between a number of weeks and a year. As Paris, Geneva, London today, it's a year. Israel, You're kidding me. 5 minutes? Couple more. All right. As I say, it takes a year or more. With respect to Israel, it's actually slowed down because it's been so active here, I think. So it used to be we got a person in and out of the door on the interview in 2 or 3 weeks from the time we sent the email or contacted the embassy. It's more like 8 weeks now. It takes about 3 weeks or so to hear back from the embassy, and they'll usually schedule it within the next 3 or 4 weeks after that. However, again, we can sort of work the network. If you really need to get out in a couple of weeks, we could probably push you through the Bahamas if that's what you wanted to do, because no one actually lives in the Bahamas. Everyone travels through the Bahamas. So again, you tell the story, they're traveling, they're on vacation, can you make an accommodation? These sort of things can be done. So if there's some great urgency, although I have to tell you, if you're in such a rush to give up your citizenship in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I suspect there's something you're not telling me. But that's a slightly separate conversation. The other sort of timing considerations that you need to be aware of is if you need to travel to the US and you need to apply for a visa, this will take time because, and I had one client do this where he literally walked out of the door in London, turned around and walked into the other door and applied for a visa. And I told him, don't do that. And the reason you shouldn't do that is because they just haven't processed all this yet. So they still have you as a US citizen because they have you as a US citizen. But he did it, and he actually got me on the phone with I was back in New York, he got me on the phone, we talked again, and they ended up issuing him a visa on the spot, as it happens. But it was a whole to-do, and I don't know that it would have turned out the same way if you do it at a separate time. So if you need to travel within some window, you have to give yourself some time for the government to send the papers back to Washington, D.C., which is what they do with the papers. Your papers are reviewed. I don't know what your papers are reviewed for. I don't know what they're looking for, as much as I've tried to find out. I have. So if anyone knows, please tell me. And then they stamp these things and they send them back. And depending on different embassies, they have a different procedure. They'll either send it directly back to the individual, or they'll send it back to the embassy, and then you have to go physically and pick it up from the embassy. And then once you have that CLN, the Certificate of Loss of Nationality, you receive back, then you know the government has processed you. You know that you can apply for a visa, and you apply for your visa in the normal course. All right, those are the immigration considerations. Let's talk about tax. There is, or can be, significant consequences to tax consequences to a person who gives up their U.S. citizenship. The government recognizes this as a method by which people avoid U.S. tax, and therefore have over the years had different regimes that they've implemented to try to reduce any tax benefit. As it happens, the current regime came into place in June of 2008. Many people remember the old regime was 10 years of continued reporting and so on, so all that is no longer in play. And the current regime is one that you could really drive a truck through in terms of tax planning, so much so that in all of the people that we've expatriated over the years, none of them have ever faced any of these negative tax consequences. We've always managed to plan around it, regardless of what the situations were. The regime is divided into two parts, what they call covered expatriates and non-covered expatriates. A covered expatriate is an expatriate to whom all the bad rules apply. They're covered by these bad rules. A non-covered one, the bad rules don't apply, you can expatriate for free. Let's talk about non-covered. In order to be non-covered, the general rule is, first, that your net worth needs to be below $2 million. Second, you have to have an annual net income tax liability to the U.S. over the last 5 years of $157,000 or less. So that's averaged over 5 years, and it's the liability to the U.S. So, assuming that now you've cleaned up your situation, you've paid all your Israeli tax, you've gotten full tax credits, even people who earn a lot of money, generally, if they're fully tax compliant in a high tax jurisdiction, they will have very little tax due in the U.S. We find on average. We don't have too much trouble meeting that $157,000 a year test. If we do have that problem, number one, high-class problem to have, but number two, there are sort of ways of managing that on a going-forward basis. It may take you another year or two, but you could file separately with your spouse, you can bring your average down. There are all kinds of things that you can do to sort of manage that. And the third rule is you must be U.S. tax compliant for the last 5 years. So if you are not U.S. tax compliant, then you are per se a covered expatriate. And, by the way, you need to file a form with the IRS that, again, signed under penalties of perjury, is Form 8854, that says you are U.S. tax compliant. If you fail to file that form, and if you fail to file that form on time, there is no way out. The rules do not work as a technical matter. You can't file the form late. You can't miss filing the form. If you don't file that form, you're covered. You are covered. So that's obviously very important. A very important nuance in all of this is, as you consider what you're going to do in terms of your disclosures, is that you can state truthfully that you're U.S. tax compliant, having never filed an F-bar. Because an F-bar is not a U.S. tax form, and because it's not a U.S. tax form, it's not covered by that particular rule. The rule under 877A says that you're compliant with all requirements under this title. And under this title, Internal Revenue Code, Title 26, Bank Secrecy Act, F-bar, Title 31. And I've always taken that interpretation because it's a literalist read of the code, but I was a little concerned about it. And I had the advantage about 6 months ago of speaking with the gentleman who wrote the code section, and he confirmed, yeah, no, that's absolutely right, and the IRS interprets it the same way. So I took some comfort in that. Whether that's the right strategy, that's a whole different story. Now, if you are, so as I say, under $2 million net worth, under $157,000 average net income tax liability, and then a statement that you have to be U.S. tax compliant and filing the appropriate 8854, you are not covered. Everyone else is covered. So if you're more than $2 million, have more net tax liability than that, or if you're not compliant. What is the consequence of being covered? There are two primary consequences. The first is there's functionally an exit tax, meaning that you're deemed to sell all of your assets worldwide the day before you expatriated, and you have to pay what's functionally a capital gains tax on that. Because it's a deemed sale, nothing actually happened. It's not like you can claim credit in Israel for any tax that you actually pay. There is an exemption. The first $660,000 of gain is exempt, but we find many people, if they were going to have gain, will be sort of out of that box. The other primary tax consequence is that if one makes a gift, now no longer being a U.S. person, and let's assume the gift was not otherwise subject to gift tax, if one makes a gift to another covered expatriate or to another U.S. person, then that gift is subject to gift tax or estate tax if the transfer was made at death. And that actually is a donee tax, not a donor tax. So they have to sort of shifted the rules a little bit there. But at the end, there is an estate or a gift tax due if you make a transfer to another covered expatriate. Now, there's some interesting exceptions to the covered expatriate rule. There are two classes of people that you'd be surprised, but we find many people fall into. And with this, I'm done. All right. That the two people that people fall into. One is if you give up your citizenship between the years of 18 and 18 and a half, this is a 6-month window, it doesn't matter what your economic situation is in terms of net worth and income tax liability, all of that, you per se do not meet those rules. You still have to be tax compliant, but you can basically give up your citizenship without any further tax concerns or any planning necessary. The other, and here's a four-part rule, but if you are dual citizen at birth, and that comes back to what I mentioned earlier, because to be a dual citizen at birth, well, it's different than having the right to claim U.S. citizenship. If you were born in Israel of U.S. parents and you have a right to claim U.S. citizenship, you weren't a dual citizen at birth. You had only a right to claim it. If you were, I've gotten advice from people like Yair and others here in Israel who tell me if you were born in the United States, clearly U.S. citizen, but you are also a per se Israeli citizen at birth, even though you may not have gotten your passport until later, then you meet the rules. So some people meet that first rule. Second rule is if you then go back to your home country, so in our example, you can't go back to the UK or to France, you have to go back to Israel, and you're tax compliant in Israel, and you've lived in Israel for 10 of the last 15 years, then, again, you don't meet prong 1 and 2, you don't have to meet the net worth test, and you don't have to meet the income test. You do not. So you can be, enormously wealthy and so on, and you per se don't meet those two tests. You still need to be U.S. tax compliant. You still need to file your 8854. But a lot of people do fit into these various exceptions, and we can use them to our advantage. There are The green card problem, everything I just said, if you've got a green card for 8 years out of 15, you're stuck. You're a U.S. person like everyone else. We have this all the time. People drop their green card in their drawer, and they don't do what they need to do to formally give up their green card. The result is they're a long-term permanent resident, and everything I just said about U.S. citizens applies to that green card holder. I won't go further. And the planning considerations, lots of things I could tell you about how to get around these rules, and you'll have to just give me a call and we can talk about it. Thank you very much.